Community Building Series, CA brings thought-provoking speakers on topics that stimulate us to discuss, engage, and build our community. And at CA, we're all about partnerships, because through partnerships, we have the power to reach our goals. Today, we partnered with the Horizon Foundation to bring Mark Fenton here. And I would like to particularly thank in the room Ian Kennedy and Glenn Schneider for their work and all the work of the Horizon Foundation. A little off topic tonight, I want to remind you of an event that CA is holding on Saturday, October 18th. It's called Columbia Speaks, CA Listens. And it's a time for your voices as community members to be heard, for you to tell us how we're doing and what you'd like to see more of and less of. It'll be a facilitated discussion from 9:30 to noon on the 18th at the Wild Lake Interfaith Center. So we hope to see you there. Now on with the show. Mark Fenton is a much sought after speaker and consultant on public health, planning, transportation, and a former host of America's Walking, a series on PBS. Mark is a published author on exercise, community health interventions, and physical activity promotion. He's also an adjunct associate professor at Tufts University, Friedman School of Nutrition Science and Policy. Are you ready to exercise your mind, to be inspired, to be entertained and informed? Are you? Yes. All right, well, let's welcome Mark Fenton.
So I want to thank Columbia Association and Horizon Foundation for having me. You guys have been wonderful hosts, and I've got to give a special nod to my friend Jennifer Toole, who's right there, hi Jen, who lives here and has been a longtime friend and colleague in the work that you're going to hear about today. And I guess I would call that work trying to build healthier communities, which is a challenging proposition, because some people would say, why do we need to build a healthier community? People can choose to be healthier if they make the right choices. But I'm going to suggest to you that there's more to it than that, and we have some pretty compelling data to suggest so. And just in case you're sleepy or you really want to hustle home to get to the Orioles game, I'm going to give you the whole talk right now on the first slide. Then you can go listen to the O's game, although Ian has promised he's going to give us score updates once it gets rolling there, just in case. Although I think we got plenty of time. Here's the short version of the story. One, from a public health standpoint, we know we should be more physically active. We're told that by lots of evidence out there. And number two, we aren't. Right? We should be more physically active, and as a society, as a species, Americans are not as physically active as we should be. Three, simply telling people that and encouraging them and giving them sort of incentives and so on is not enough. It doesn't work. It doesn't get us going. But building environments that support physical activity does. That actually works. We've got some evidence around that. And that means we need to do those things, right? So we know that it works. We know telling people doesn't. But that means we've got to actually decide to do that. And that's where you come in. Because quite frankly, although some of our elected officials and public leaders will take this position, many more of them need the push of the public to do the right thing. And I am going to admonish you to be the public that does that, okay? Because they need help. So we have people like Jen who's here. Did we give Jen a wave earlier? Jen, where is she now? There she is. Thank you. She was even here this morning and is back today. She's one of those gluttons for punishment. She's into this stuff. But not necessarily everybody is. So I commend that and I thank her for that. So you guys can help your elected leaders, city staff, county staff, CA staff, get to the space where we do this stuff. So that's what my challenge to you is. Now, I'm going to tell you that I'm actually lucky enough, just to give you a sense of the scale of the challenge, I think. I'm staying at the Sheraton, which is right there on the lake, right at the center, town center, and that's some of the housing that's right near it, and there's a wonderful trail. I had to go to the mall to pick something up. I was, which it's right there, right? The mall's right there. All the retail in the world. She's shaking her head. Why are you shaking your head so vehemently, Joan?
Unless you know how to get there, you can't get there.
Well, that's a funny thing that you should say that, because that was my walk up the street there. Now, there's construction going on, so I kind of understand that. But even on the other side of the street where there's no construction, no sidewalk, so great access to that parking garage back there. But sort of, I'm walking in the street to get to this crossing of the tiny little road that's the ring around the center there. You know that tiny little road? which has, I don't know, 87 lanes? No, well, 6 easily lanes on top. And the crosswalk, I mean, that appears to be a crosswalk, doesn't it, guys? There's the recess there. There's the trail to receive me over here. Here's the sort of curb ramp over here. If I were in my wheelchair, I'd have to get across the grass, but I'd at least, but nothing to mark it, nothing to tell a car that I might be crossing there, right? Sort of not an encouraging environment, other than if you're fairly ambitious and are really inspired to make your way over to the mall. There's a lot there. Oh, and by the way, when you get to the mall, you run into the giant parking structure, which I'm standing on top of right here. I was pretty sure security was going to get me, because I actually climbed up on the parapet to get this picture. But I ran away before the security car came. To see that, by the way, some of the best access to the mall is from the parking structure. Right? We invest an awful lot, presuming you're coming by car and departing by car, and the whole system's built for a car, really. And on the one hand, that just seems like a funny little anecdote. On the other, it's at the very heart of how we do most of our design in the United States, or have at least for the last several decades. And we're now paying, I would say, a public health price as well as others for it. But let's put this in perspective with a little exercise that I do with a lot of groups, and I'm going to ask you guys to do with me, and it begs your indulgence, but I wish you'll bear with me. I'd like everybody in the room to set some context here. I want you to close your eyes, and I want you to think back to your earliest fond recollections of having been physically active as a youngster. And when I say close your eyes, I mean close your eyes and picture it. Actually imagine yourself and think about who you were with, where you were. Think of the physical spaces you were in when you were being physically active as a kid. What were you doing? What kind of activities were you doing? Get an image of yourself. I'm saying close your eyes. Is there a problem? You don't like to close your eyes. Okay. Some people are nervous. I'm going to sneak up on them when their eyes are closed. Okay, so you have this image, who you were with, where you were, physically what you were doing. Once you've got that image, turn to the person next to you and share those recollections right now. Just 10 seconds each. Say what it was you remember doing as a kid. Sir, what did you say? What was your? And what was your activity? Say it again.
Urban and Georgia fight outside all the time.
Where? Just around the neighborhood? Anything? Okay. And I know it'd be more fun to keep talking about that than listen to me, but bear with me. I'm going to ask a series of questions about those recollections. I want you to raise your hand if your answer is affirmative regarding that recollection from that time in your life. So, how many of you recalled things that largely occurred at a scheduled time and place? Scheduled activities. Raise your hand for that. How many largely thought of things where you were only with kids of the same age and gender as you? So if you were a 6-year-old boy, you're only with 6-year-old boys. Okay, some of you. How many remembered activities where there had to be an adult present to do it? How many remembered activities? How many remember activities where you got a uniform? You had to wear or purchase or have a uniform? Some. How many remembered largely activities where there had to be an umpire or a referee or something like that to do it? Few. Okay. How many remembered activities where you were with kids of different ages and different genders? So it might have been boys and girls. It might have been the older kids and the younger guys playing together, whatever you could get to get a team up. Wiffle ball in my backyard, all the neighborhood kids. Somebody brought their younger brother, they were full-time catcher. No, seriously, you know, or goalie. Younger brothers are great for goalies. Just fire away. How many remember activities that there was not necessarily an adult present? There wasn't necessarily. How many can recall activities you would not have gotten away with if an adult had in fact been present? And tell the truth. A good number of those. How many remember activities that involve water, swimming in it, or fishing in it, or paddling a canoe, or playing just in a neighborhood creek or something like that? Swimming in the quarry that we were not supposed to go to. Also falls in the no parental guidance category too. How many remember a wheeled vehicle being part of this period of your life? A bicycle, a scooter, a skateboard, a big wheel, a trike, roller skates. How many remember this period of your life to some degree or another having been what I like to call a free-range kid? Who says, yeah, I kind of was a free-range kid. Could take off on a Saturday morning, play all day. I grew up in a small town upstate New York called Brockport outside of Rochester, New York. It's along the Erie Canal. There was this towpath trail. We could say to my mom on Saturday morning, we're going to take off on the trail, and she'd say, be home by supper time. We'd try to ride to the adjoining town on our bikes before a certain time and make it back. A lot of free-range kids in the room. Last two questions. These are the important ones. How many believe most kids growing up today are free-range kids? The majority of kids in America today, or Howard County, are free-range kids. Look around. No. Last question. How many think it's good for America's youth that we're raising a robust and healthy generation by virtue of them not being free range? Good thing we don't have free range kids anymore. Hands up for that. Think about what we've just said. As recently as a generation or two ago, we had a lot of free range kids. We don't anymore, and we agree it's not good for them. To which I have asked every group I ever test this with one simple question: what are you doing about it? You know we were, you know they're not, you know it's not good for them. Why are you not trying to fix it? Now I hope the answer is, that's why I came tonight, Mark. I want to be one of the people who's trying to fix it. Because that's what we're up to. That's why I served for 6 years on my local planning board, and why my wife serves on our open space committee, and why we devote tons of time to this kind of work in our neighborhoods and our community, and so that I don't just go around practicing what I preach. I mean, don't go talking about it. I try to practice what I preach. I try to actually, and that's what I'm challenging you to do. And there are lots of ways to do that. Now, let me be very clear. When we ask people, by the way, okay, so this idea of free range kids, when we ask people, why are they hesitant to let their kids now be free range like we were when we were kids? What's the answer? It's not safe. Scary men with big thick mustaches are hiding behind every tree. Parents aren't home, speeding cars. Now we're starting to talk about some of the stuff that's real, because what we know about the data is the risk of an abduction by an unknown assailant is no different now than it was 40 or 50 years ago. In fact, and the striking thing is something else also is driving this, because there's a dramatic change. If you look at, for example, how kids get to school, in 1970-ish, we're talking about 40%, the green bar here, 40% of kids walked and biked to school, and only about 15% were driven by car. You look in 2000, those numbers have almost identically reversed. It's almost half of kids are being driven by car, and only about 40% are walking and bicycling. Dramatic change in 30 years. It also happens to be the 30 years in which childhood obesity rates tripled. I say happens to be, but I believe in no way is that coincidence. I believe they are directly related. As we got in the habit of putting our kids in the back seat of the car, this is what we helped create. And we've got to ask the question, are we going to sort of accept the notion that roads are wider, traffic is faster, vehicles are larger, and that's okay? That's a reason not to put our kids out there, or are we going to do something about it? And I acknowledge things like more single-parent households, more households in which both parents work. There are a lot of other socio-demographic changes, but still our job is to remedy it. Because although people will say the reason is it's not safe out there, from the imaginary abductor, if you will, what we're really acknowledging, if we think about this carefully, the risk our kids are facing is the fact that 1 in 3 born today will get a disease that as recently as 20 years ago clinicians called adult onset diabetes. It was called adult onset diabetes because we thought you couldn't get it till you were 40 or older. Do you guys know what the clinical term for that disease is? Type 2 diabetes. Why don't we call it adult onset anymore? To be very clear, we see it in 8 and 9-year-olds. Right? School nurses today have to be taught how to take blood glucose measures and administer diabetes medications. That's a disease a school nurse didn't have to do 20 years ago. That's an astonishing change from a public health standpoint in a matter of decades. And I believe it is strongly related to the fact that our kids are not as free range as we were. They are getting so much less physical activity. Indeed, I would suggest to you the 2 risk factors, we know the 2 risk factors that, other than genetics, that drive your likelihood of type 2 diabetes are physical inactivity and poor nutrition. Being sedentary and not eating a good diet, right? So those are the epidemics I argue that we ought to be talking about. I mention this because there are a lot of people who want to talk about America's obesity epidemic. I think it is totally wrong-headed and not at all helpful to talk about that. In part because I think it blames the individual, and in part because we know, and this is important, physical activity and nutrition are independent risk factors. If we can help a person eat a better diet and be more physically active, they will live a longer, healthier life, even if weight does not change dramatically. Who will join me? If you don't take anything else from tonight in my campaign to change the conversation and make sure when we talk about this, we talk about the twin epidemics of inactivity and poor nutrition and say that's what we want to change. We want to help people be more active. We want to help them eat a better diet. Who would join me in that campaign? Hands up. This is not a rhetorical question, and this is not raising your hand. This is Mark. I am too dang lazy. All I want is your elbow as high as your ear. Give it to me. Come on. Who's with me on this campaign? Wait. Keep them up there. I'm not making you do jumping jacks, for God's sake. Put your hand up if you're willing to join my campaign. Okay, wait, let's do it this way. Who wants to keep talking about the obesity epidemic? Because that's been working really well. Good, because all I was going to do was berate you publicly in front of the group, if that's what you chose. which is what we do, by the way, to severely overweight people in our society, right? We ostracize the individual. It's not helpful. It doesn't help advance the cause, and it doesn't even help solve the problem, because helping people be active, eat a better diet, they'll live longer. Okay, so we've started there. Let's change the conversation. I'm going to admit a bias in tonight's conversation. I'm going to talk more about physical activity because it's relevant to our topic. It's the area I work in most. It's not because it's more important. I commend those of you that are working on nutritional campaigns. The Horizon Foundation, for example, we talked about their work to reduce the consumption of sugar-sweetened beverages, right? Take sodas out of schools and out of lunch programs, and sort of in general, just have kids drinking less. It's very commendable, very important. But let's talk about the physical activity side, in part because that's how my background. I did things like worked at the U.S. Olympic Training Center in their sports biomechanics laboratory. I studied biomechanics in part of my time at MIT. I worked for Reebok in their human performance lab, sort of the sneaker guys. So I come from a sports science background. I actually was a competitive athlete, if you can call it that. In the weirdest event that they do in track and field, does anybody know what the weirdest looking event in track and field is? High jump. Somebody says, no. Much weirder than triple jump and pole vault. No. No, yet sillier than that. Fast walking, the gentleman says. We call it competitive race walking, but indeed here is photographic evidence that yes, you are right. It is the goofiest looking event in all of track and field. Me, back in my competitive days, as I tell people, it was so long ago that we only had black and white photography, and those shorts were in style. That's how long it is. The 1920 National Championships. That's actually, it was hosted in Washington, D.C. That's the Lincoln Memorial in the background. That was the National 20-kilometer Invitational. I'm not kidding. And many people will ask, why, Mark, race walking? If you were a decent endurance athlete, why didn't you do one of the real events, like the marathon or something like that? Why race? And it's obvious when I show you my next slide, which is, of course, the huge crowds that showed up at our competitions. Also not a fabricated photo. That's the start of the 1984 Olympic trials and the 50-kilometer race walk. If you want to win a bar bet somebody that they don't know what the longest foot race in the Olympics is. What do you think the longest foot race is? No, many people would say the marathon, right? At 26 miles. 50-kilometer race walk's 31 miles, 5 miles longer. You'll win every time. By the way, that's the Coliseum in Los Angeles. LA hosted the '84 games, and they also hosted the Olympic trials. And when you do the Olympic trials, what they do is they start you very early in the morning to avoid the heat of the day. So we and the marathon runners, what we would do is start on the stadium track, go out, do a loop in the city, come back in, finish on the track. 10 o'clock in the morning when we finished, stadium was packed. They announced our names and came in. It was like really cool. And in 10th place, you're not hearing this at all, are you? It's not even working. From the Greater Boston Track Club, Mark Fenton. It was very cool. But at 6 in the morning when we started, to avoid the heat, you can in fact see right up there my mom and dad specifically. Swear to God. They're like, my mother is like, way to go, sweetheart, just 30 miles to go, honey. And so I'm, thanks, Mom. Doing my thing. So I'm telling you this because I came from the whole sports world. It was sort of, I've been there for the running boom. We've tested elite athletes, Billy Rogers on the treadmills at the Olympic Training Center. When it was going to be aerobics, or it was going to be after that guy. Remember when, what was his name? Bill Koch won the skiing medals. Everybody was going to take up cross-country skiing. And then Chrissy Everett, we were all going to play tennis. Right? I'm not making this up. We've been through every one of these booms, none of which has actually made anything better, as is evidenced by just 3 numbers that I will tell you. 30, 20, 365. 30 is the minutes per day. We're told every American adult should be physically active as a minimum. Kids need at least 60 minutes a day. These are minimum recommendations. We know more is better. But at least if you do this, you will be reduced risk for cardiovascular disease, type 2 diabetes, osteoporosis, high blood pressure, clinical depression, dementia in old age, cancer. The list goes on. Every time they do a new study, what they learn is modest daily physical activity reduces your risk for all of the stuff that kills us in modern American society. All of the chronic diseases, seriously. That's the good news. The bad news is that fewer than 20% of Americans actually get it. It may well be closer to 10% or even 5% based on objective measurement. The numbers that you hear, like, 40%, maybe 50% of Americans actually meet these guidelines, are based on all of the self-report data, the studies that come from telephone surveys where they ask you how active you are. But if they actually measure it, in the studies where they put something on your hip or measure it, you end up with numbers closer to 5 to 10% of society. I'm not saying that to upset you. It's just the reality of what we face. We think we do more. We confuse being busy with being physically active, and they are two very dramatically different things. Driving your kids around all day to activities is not the same as actually being physically active. Did everybody get that? And, sort of having meetings all day. God, it was so busy today. I'm exhausted. In meetings all day, 3 conference calls, and then that long meeting with Bob, not being physically active. Okay. The last point here, 365, what must that be, of course? Days of the year. Here's the grim number. Add 3 zeros, and you have an estimate of the number of premature deaths annually in the United States due to physical inactivity and poor nutrition. The so-called obesity epidemic, but we know to be the epidemics of inactive lifestyles and poor nutrition, it is second only to tobacco, as the number 1 killer. And in part, tobacco is a larger number because of the effect of secondhand smoke. So my cigarettes not only kill me, but potentially those who are exposed to the smoke from them as well. So here's what we know. Those are the big 3, physical inactivity, poor nutrition, and tobacco use, that are driving the healthcare system in this country into the ground. Quick side note, if you have a moment or an opportunity to speak to a state or a federal legislator, and they say to you, if you know that they are arguing about whether Obamacare is a good or a bad thing, whether we need a market-based system or a single-payer system, and they're really up in arms about that and screaming and pounding the table about it, please call their office and tell them to shut up, because I'm quite sincere. I've done this when I've had an opportunity for legislative testimony. If you're talking about how we pay for it, you are effectively rearranging the deck chairs on the Titanic while we steam into the iceberg. Because the iceberg is, we aren't doing a thing about these 3 risk factors. We have to dramatically change our risk for tobacco use, physical inactivity, and poor nutrition if you care about our healthcare system at all in this country, and it becoming remotely sustainable over the long term. Everybody understand what I just said? Okay. And if you want to challenge me on that, go right ahead. I will crush you with the data, and it will break your heart. It will make you so sad before we're done. So instead, accept my argument and help me change the conversation about healthcare in this country. Let's talk about what the health community would call primary prevention. Let's keep people from getting sick in the first place rather than figure out how to pay for it after they are. Fair enough? Okay. So these are our big numbers. Why, by the way, last public health point here that sets us up for the rest of our conversation. Well, because of what I call the stickiness problem, which is well represented by an interesting study that a colleague did that tried to get people to walk 40 minutes a day. It was not a particularly elaborate study. They had a bunch of people, they signed them up, they put them in 3 groups. One group, they said, try to walk 40 minutes all at once sometime during the day. Second group, they said, you can break it into 4 10-minute walks if that's more convenient. And the third group was not only allowed to break it into 4 10-minute walks, but they put a treadmill in their house. How cool is that? Treadmill in your house, go jump on, 10 minutes anytime you want. And then over 6 months, they did all the stuff we know works. Called them on the phone, sent them email reminders, set up walking groups, taught them how to warm up before and how to stretch after so they didn't get injured, and how to select good walking shoes, all that good stuff. They gave them exercise diary, and if you filled it out and turned it in, you got prizes like t-shirts and water bottles and baseball hats and fanny packs, because we love giving that stuff away in health promotion, right? Who has received or given a t-shirt, baseball hat, fanny pack, water bottle, or some other tchotchke at a health fair, or at a bike to work week, or, come on, tell the truth. You've been involved, okay, over 2/3 of the room. And we do that because it works. Look, over the 6 months of the exercise study, everybody increased their exercise minutes per week. It's also not the interesting question, certainly not the important one. The important one from a public health standpoint is what happens after I stop calling you on the phone, sending you email reminders, and giving you t-shirts and water bottles. Then what happens? That's the interesting question. Now, I want everybody in the room to vote for one of the 3 arrows, which is a trend line for the whole group in the study. And I'm going to tell you some inside information. At this point, they had statistically significant increases in aerobic fitness and decreases in weight. So let me just tell you, just walking on average 30 to 40 minutes per day, people were losing weight and getting more aerobically fit. Pretty cool news, right? Okay, based on that 6-month experience, how many people believe the trend for the group after continued to go up? Nobody? How many believe that they at least maintained their activity level, that the trend was plateaued? Okay, good. I appreciate your optimism, if nothing else. He looks around like, wait, am I the only person who raised my hand? How many believe it dropped off? Well, you guys all have a bad attitude. I should send you all out of here, except for, of course, the fact that you're right. We don't have lots and lots of these studies. Most of them end right here after 6 months. The funding actually often concludes there. So we declare victory. We got these people to exercise more. Good. Walking's good for you, which it is. We know that modest amounts of physical activity work. What we don't know is how to get it to stick, hence the stickiness problem. How do we get a behavior change to stick? And by the way, we've got lots of research in the weight loss category, lots of studies. I could show you study after study shaped like this. Early weight loss followed by regain. In this study, they're comparing Weight Watchers to being in a self-help program, but you'll notice the shape of the curve is the same. We successful for a while, and then and that's because it's based only on a behavior change program where we encourage, cajole, teach, beg, give awards, right? But it's not enough. What we've realized is if we're going to be effective in any of this stuff, we've got to engage in more of a lifestyle-based change. We've got to help people build activity into what they're doing every day. For that matter, we can't get people on diets. We have to create food systems where they have healthy choices all the time. We can't just tell people not to smoke. We have to create environments and policies that discourage them from smoking. And from a physical activity standpoint, this is a fairly recent phenomenon. Because until fairly recently, we were active as a part of daily life. It's not that we've stopped exercising, it's that we stopped moving as a part of how we live. These are two interesting historic museums where reenactors in the state of Massachusetts, where I'm from, actually act out. So on the left, Plymouth Plantation, that's where the Pilgrims landed. So there are a bunch of people living or acting out living like the Pilgrims lived. And you watch them after a day of thatching the roofs of their buildings and working in the fields and trying to move the cow back into the corral after a day, whacking him with a stick and all this stuff. It's amazing. I'm not thinking, or for that matter, the one on the right is the Lowell National Historic Park. It's a turn-of-the-century water-driven mill complex in Lowell, Massachusetts. If you're into that stuff, it's a really cool, the Industrial Museum. It's an Industrial Revolution sort of reenactment site. It's so cool. But after a day of working, the looms in there are carrying bales of textiles up and down 3 stories in this building. I'm thinking people didn't come home and say, well, just finished another 12-hour shift at the mill. I think I'll go for a run, right? Gonna go hit the weight room, honey, and lift a little. You get my point, right? They were active as a part of daily life. Not so much anymore. Maybe a FedEx delivery person. But I'm not kidding, right? I mean, who really moves that much in their daily lives? All right, I have an approach. I am looking for a community in which to pilot it. Maybe Columbia is it. Now, this is out there a little bit, but I will be famous for it someday. It's called PAPI. It's an acronym, and it stands for, by the way, if anybody really wants to work on this with me later, just come up, slide me a card. We'll talk about what we got to do to launch it. Physical activity promotion through predator introduction. I think it's going to be huge. It's going to be big. A lot of physical activity, most of it high intensity, somewhat anaerobic, full speed sprinting. Unfortunately, can't get any funding. I don't know what the problem is. So I just think we introduce our natural predators right back into our living environment. When you were in at the registration table, you'd be like this. I gotta tell you, that mountain lion that they released down the street, that thing is fast. I got a stitch, I think. I presented this to a group at the Centers for Disease Control. I'm not kidding, this is a true story. A good friend of mine, one of the docs there, said, Fenton, it's kind of interesting because it's sort of Darwinian. I said, that's right. You don't have to be able to run faster than the bear, just the person you're with. You knew that was coming. She's going, yeah, I saw that a mile away. Call the less active from the herd. That's what I said. No funding. So I guess we're going to have to go with what the research says. What the research says is you can't just scold, tell, encourage, educate. You actually have to have other influences in a person's life beyond just the individual approach, influence them in that direction. They have family and friends and the institutions, the community by its physical design and even public policies have to encourage the behavior you're talking about. And this is not really that foreign a concept. If you think about it, we've been successful in American society in major health initiatives for well over a century. Certainly more recent ones are things like tobacco use. We don't make it hard to smoke in public places. Could you smoke in this building? Is it legal? Right? It's not allowed. Bars and restaurants, right? All sorts of public places now. Many school campuses, 24/7, 365, no smoking. And that's, by the way, not because we say don't smoke, it's bad for you. We do that, and there are smoking cessation programs available. We also have taxed the daylights out of the product. We make it hard to smoke in public places. We've stopped advertising on television, right? We've changed the entire social norms around smoking, tobacco use. Agreed? Same with child safety restraints and seatbelts. I would argue with recycling. I can't go through an airport in America now without recycling bins right next to all the trash bins. That's an environmental change, right? It's hard for me to put the plastic bottle in the trash if the one is right there. And I'd argue one of our great successes from a public health standpoint has been water quality. We take for granted that we don't have cholera outbreaks like the horrible tragedy still ongoing in Haiti right now because there are detailed ordinances. I serve on my local planning board. We do a lot of time reviewing the stormwater calculations and either the septic or the sewer hookup and requirement and so on. It's exhaustive by law. And if they don't meet the standards, I have the regulatory power to reject the application. You're not building the subdivision till you meet our standards. Why? Because public health has taught us the collective benefit of clean water is worth the expense. These are really important lessons. What would the equivalent be for physical activity? Well, what if every time you walked out your front door, if the distance you were going were short enough that you could actually walk to the destination? If it were nearby enough that you felt it was safe and there were facilities that got you there, and if the distance were a little farther, it wouldn't be unreasonable to ride a bike. There's a place to park the bike when you get to the other end, and you'd feel safe riding that bicycle. And then if you had to go further still, there were good, reliable, frequent, not very expensive transit that would get you to the greater distance still. And only as a last resort did you have to get in your car. Well, nice concept, Mark, but that doesn't really exist. To which I ask this question: has anybody in this room traveled anywhere in the world? Forget the United States. Let's leave aside the United States. Have you been anywhere outside the United States where you'd say, I think people actually live this way? Where? Panama. Interesting. I would not have gone Central America first, but I believe you. Paris, France, for sure. Japan. Many people say, they say you can't have everybody have a car. The population density for where people live and so on and where they have to travel wouldn't physically work.
The Netherlands.
The Netherlands, sure, right? Amsterdam, but where? Denmark. Copenhagen is held out as an international example, right? Copenhagen, but indeed the nation has embraced this. Denmark has done some of the best work at safe routes to school and some of the pioneering work in encouraging kids to walk and bike to school in the world. Okay, it happens in other places. But has anybody been anywhere in the United States where you think they actually live like that? I mean, that's crazy. What? D.C., he says, D.C. New York City. Only big cities? Where? Ann Arbor, Michigan. Okay, so university towns. In fact, let's go down the list. Madison and Boulder and Burlington, Vermont. Notably, by the way, cold weather cities, pretty successful at this. Minneapolis and St. Paul, quite successful. Yeah, they're getting there. Come on, she's giving it this. Minneapolis is doing a pretty dang good job for a big city in a really cold region. Anybody else? Anywhere else you've been? Calgary. Boston, nice. Not just big cities, those small towns. So here's what you might not know if you haven't traveled. There are a lot of small towns across the Midwest in the United States that aren't even university towns that are still built in a style that's actually surprisingly encouraging to that lifestyle. They have an old downtown green that has the church and the school and the town hall and the post office still arrayed along it. This is a classic New England model too. Nearby, a grid network of streets with homes on fairly small parcels, neighborhood parks. Any of this sound remotely familiar? Grid network of streets, well connected. All of what you need you can walk to. Downtown has a hardware store, grocery store, laundromat, dry cleaner, right? Cafe, a couple of restaurants. Multi-story, right? First floor is retail, but apartments or condos or maybe store owners live right above them. Oh, Mark, you're doing nostalgia. You're doing Pleasantville, aren't you? You're doing the kind of pretend imagine world. I'm going to suggest to you that we've got to reimagine a world where we don't just depend on people who go to the gym. Some people are going to do that, but that number is about 5 to 10%. We've got to think about a world where those pictures on the bottom represent normal. And not just those people going along the lake, right here, for like an exercise walk, but this guy who's clearly on a functional trip. Would you agree? He's dressed in a tie and a jacket. Also Washington, by the way, just because I love the picture of him in a jacket. I wish he had a helmet, yes, for my safety advocates in the room. I'm with you on that. Be better. But my point is, something has created enough incentive for him that it's cheaper, safer, more convenient, less of a hassle to actually ride his bike than to try to drive a car and park it down there, right? Pretty interesting. He may not even be doing it for health purposes, but remember, if he takes a 15-minute ride to his destination and then 15 minutes back, he hit the 30, he's already gaining that benefit that we talked about before. Got it? Doesn't have to change his clothes, doesn't have to go to a gym, doesn't even have to consciously think it's exercise.